Thank you. It is such a joy and a pleasure to be here. And Margaret, thank you so much for that lovely introduction. Let's get started. So what I thought we could start with is a little ditty to let our brains marinate in as we go through this, and we'll see if we can answer it together at the end. Many years after the last Indian ancestor of Buddhism, named Bodhidharma, had traveled to China, Dazu Hoika, depicted here, wished to study with the enigmatic teacher. And Bodhidharma had settled into a cave and had been meditating for 9 years by just staring at the wall. And Hoika was earnest, and he really wanted to study with the teacher, and eventually, out of desperation, he cut off his arm and presented it to Bodhidharma. You can see that here. Upon seeing this, Bodhidharma said, "What do you want?" Hoika said, "My mind is not at ease. Please pacify my mind." Bodhidharma said, "Bring me your mind and I will pacify it." Hoika replied, "When I look for my mind, I cannot find it. There, I have pacified it for you." So just let that sit as we go through the talk. As Margaret mentioned, this is a view from my office window. If you're ever down in the Worcester area, please come visit us at the Center for Mindfulness. We have a wonderful center that's been around for 35 years and a wonderful new building on a satellite campus of the medical school. So to get warmed up for that little koan, I thought we could start with something a little easier, like why Facebook's like crack cocaine. And then we can move on to McDonald's, Lolo Jones, and finally, how we can all become a Buddha in 9 minutes and maybe even quit smoking. Okay? So that's a tall order to do in 45 minutes or so. Let's see if we can get to it. But before we start with Facebook, I thought we could talk about stress. As you know, with the anti-cancer lifestyle, stress is a big issue. And it's actually a huge issue. In the U.S., there were some recent studies done showing that half of the U.S. population reports major stressful events in the past year. Half. Okay? So half of you in the audience, on average, have experienced a major stressful event in the past year. And as we all know, stress is hugely aversively effective on our health. And 3/4 of the population in this survey reported just that stress was negatively affecting their health. So we can ask ourselves, well, okay, if stress is such a problem, we need to figure out where it comes from. So Peter Selye, back in the 50s, gave a very academic definition. The consequences of the failure to respond appropriately to the emotional or physical stressors. Great. Sounds good. What are we really talking about? 2,500 years ago, in the early Buddhist psychology, they described this very simply. They said, now what, friends, is the noble truth of stress? Not getting what is wanted is stressful. Not getting what is wanted. I'm sure some of us can relate to this, if not all of us. So let's get on to how the system gets set up. Now this is a picture, some of you might be familiar with the Louvre, the entrance to the Louvre in Paris. I was there last December giving a talk and playing tourist because I'd never been there before, and I snapped this picture for 2 reasons. One, how many of you know what this is? Yes, exactly. One of Time Magazine's top 25 inventions of 2014, the selfie stick. In my opinion, that's a sign of the apocalypse. But anyway, the second piece of this is these 2 women are taking pictures of themselves at the Louvre, and now this is the boyfriend rendered obsolete. And you can see he's kind of hunched over. He's like, what do I do now? So imagine you're in Paris. It's your first time to Paris. You're really excited. And you start thinking, oh, yeah, this is awesome. I'm going to take a picture of myself and post it on Facebook and show all my friends. So your brain says, that's a great idea. Hurry up and post it. And you post it on Facebook. And you get all these likes. And, wow, I wish I were in Paris. And all these comments. And your brain says, that was awesome. That was a great idea. Don't do that again. Now, it turns out that when you put people in an fMRI scanner and you measure their brain activity, when you give them 2 things, you give them the choice to talk about themselves or earn money, guess what they do? Yes, talk about themselves. And it turns out when people self-disclose and they're talking about themselves, they activate a part of their brain called the nucleus accumbens, which is the same part of the brain that gets activated when you smoke crack cocaine. And there was another study here done in 2013 where they actually could predict the amount of time people spend on Facebook by the amount that their brain activates, their nucleus accumbens gets activated when they're self-disclosing. So it's rewarding to talk about ourselves. We get excited, and you can think of that Facebook example. Okay, but how is this perpetuated? How does stress continue? Now, it turns out, if we go back to our Facebook example, our brain might think, oh yeah, well, if you feel bad, you should go on to Facebook and you'll feel better. You can regulate your mood this way. But of course, it turns out that this is not such a good idea. It leads to negative outcomes. And some are studying this, as you saw from the title, as Facebook addiction disorder, because we get sucked into thinking, oh, if I just go to Facebook, I'll feel better. So before I go on, I mentioned some early Buddhist psychology. I just want to frame this historically. So who is this guy, Siddhartha Gautama, this historical figure? Now, the way I'm going to be talking about this tonight is not as Buddhism as a religion, but this was a historical figure that some asked, are you a god? Are you Superman? But I prefer to think of him, and others have described him as a super scientist. So this was a guy that was one of the earliest psychologists, where he looked deeply into the mind and could see the inner workings and how things happened without the use of computers, without the use of statistics, without the use of torturing animals. He did all of this just by looking into his mind. So that's how we're going to frame this tonight, not as some religion or something else, but really just as a scientific figure, as a psychologist. So when you look at the early Buddhist psychology, they describe this process that I'm talking about with the Facebook example. So you go to, you're in Paris, you get a great photo op for a selfie, your brain interprets that as pleasant and says that's a great idea. You get this urge to post on Facebook, you do it, and then this lays down this memory. And the way they described it was the birth of a self-identity. We start to get this identity around something, whether it's, I'm somebody that goes on exotic vacations, or I'm somebody that smokes cigarettes when I get stressed out. Now, the other interesting piece here is that this loop was described as samsara. Probably many of you have heard of that term. The literal translation of samsara is endless wandering. Why? Because when we're doing these things, we're endlessly looking for happiness, looking for a way to reduce our stress, but actually providing solutions that don't affect the actual cause itself. And the way that they describe this is we start to see the world through a lens of ignorance. We start to see the world in a certain way, through certain glasses, and we interpret that world through this bias. Okay, so keep this in mind. And the key here is that this self-identity, the identification around something, really is a linchpin to this problem. Okay. So I think Alan Watts summed it up really nicely. He describes this, the ego as the self which he has believed himself to be is nothing but a pattern of habits, because the more we habitually do this or that, the more we take that to be me. So I'm just going to show a video that highlights this. This is a recent Weight Watchers commercial.
If you're happy and you know it, eat a snack. If you're happy and you know it, eat a snack. If you're happy and you know it, then your face will surely show it. If you're happy and you know it, eat a snack. If you're sad and you know it, eat a snack. If you're sad and you know it, eat a snack. If you're sad because you're angry, feeling down, or generally bad, if you're sad, eat a snack. If you're bored and you know it, eat a snack. If you're lonely and you know it, eat a snack. If you're sleepy and you know it, if you're guilty and you know it, if you're stressed, eat a snack. If you're human and you know it, then your face will surely show it. If you're human, eat your feelings, eat a snack.
If you're human and you know it. So this is pretty remarkable, because those early Buddhist psychologists described what in modern days we call positive and negative reinforcement, or operant conditioning. And this has been described in a number of ways. It was described over 100 years ago by Thorndike, B.F. Skinner, who was a famous behaviorist, did a lot of animal studies showing this, and even Eric Kandel got the Nobel Prize for showing this process was true in the sea slug, which only has 20,000 neurons total. And I'm just using smoking and eating as an example, but you get the picture, and I think the Weight Watchers commercial really nailed it, because it's both positive and negative reinforcement that reinforce these types of behaviors. Now, it's interesting, if you look at addictions, whether it's an eating addiction or a smoking or any type of behavioral addiction that we're trying to use as a way to work with our stress, let's use AA as an example, Alcoholics Anonymous. There's a saying in there, people, places, and things. If you avoid people, places, and things, then you won't have an urge to drink. And it makes sense. It fits with these models because you're less likely to have input here. Well, if you smoke, it's a little harder to do because you can't avoid your front porch, your car outside of work. You can't avoid your life. So then they employ substitution strategies. Chew on your pen cap, eat carrot sticks, or whatnot. Now, the problem here is, let's use carrot sticks as an example. It was Easter recently. So you run out of carrot sticks, and you go to and your brain says, where are my carrot sticks? And you say, well, it's Easter and the Easter bunny, and there are no more carrot sticks at the grocery store. And your brain says, oh, you're going back to smoking, because you haven't actually dismantled the loop at its core, okay? So that's really important. Now, again, the early Buddhist psychologists described this. They said the linchpin is craving. Just as a tree, though cut down, can grow again and again if its roots are undamaged and strong, in the same way, if the roots of craving are not wholly uprooted, sorrows will come again and again. Now, I like this modern-day interpretation a little bit better, right? But you get the idea. And the food industry said, yeah, we get the idea. We're going to hire people to engineer food, to have that perfect balance so that you're going to crave it even more, and we're going to make tons of money from it. McDonald's flaunts this. Kellogg's has gotten into the game. Now you can buy Crave cereal. And if milk chocolate Crave isn't good enough, don't worry, there's double chocolate Crave. And we all know where this leads, right? Okay. So if we can understand what the problem is, then we can start to effect a cure. But if we can't properly diagnose it, we can't properly get the right medicine. So this is where mindfulness comes in. And many of you are probably have become familiar, at least with the name mindfulness. It was on the cover of Time magazine last year. Anderson Cooper did a 60 Minutes story last December about mindfulness. So just to make sure we're all on the same page, here's a simple working definition that John Kabat-Zinn laid out a while ago. So it's paying attention on purpose in the present moment, non-judgmentally. So you could be sitting here paying attention to this talk thinking, yeah, I'm paying attention, and it sucks, right? So that's not mindfulness. Mindfulness is removing those glasses like, oh, I know what the guy's going to say, or he's, or this or that, and really stepping back and saying, well, what's actually going on here? Okay, so that's the difference, but that's really critical piece. It's like two sides of the same coin. You have to be paying attention, but in a way where you're really being curious and open to whatever's happening. Now, where mindfulness is theoretically suggested to work is not through avoidance or substitution, but actually as a wedge of awareness that's driven in when we have an urge to act, when we have an urge to habitually react to a situation or a stimulus, and instead have the space to respond. So be able to respond instead of react. Now, let's see if this is actually true. There's been a lot of work now around mindfulness training. For anxiety, depression, pain. We've done some work with addiction. It's even been shown to boost immune system function. You can boost your immune titer when you get mindfulness training, when you get MBSR training, for example. It's been shown to work with people with psoriasis, where stress is a big component that affects their skin disease. And you can even, if you want to go to grad school, you can even boost your GRE scores. Now, this is pretty funny, because we're training people to pay attention. Well, of course, if you pay attention, you're going to do better on your exams. So these are just some examples of how mindfulness seems to be working empirically. Now, it's only, this field in the West is only about 35 years old, so it's still relatively young. But there's some promising data suggesting there might be some efficacy. Now, with regard specifically to the talk this evening, mindfulness training has been shown to specifically affect, so we talked about stress. It decreases mood disturbances, anger, and anxiety in a study that was across a number of individuals with different types of cancers. It's been shown to improve adjustment to a cancer diagnosis, which itself can be tremendously stressful. And it's even been shown to decrease pro-inflammatory cytokines, decrease blood pressure, as well as cortisol, this stress hormone level in individuals with breast and prostate cancer. And this has been shown to last up to a year after taking a mindfulness-based stress reduction class, which the class itself only lasts 8 weeks. So we can see with mindfulness, we can affect both the sequelae as well as the kind of side effects, if you think of stress as side effect of cancer, directly. So how does this actually work? How can just paying attention actually affect these types of things? You know, the idea is just pay attention and everything else will take care of itself. So in our clinic, we were teaching people mindfulness as a way to quit smoking. And what we told them on the first day was, okay, you can go ahead and smoke. And of course, they look at us funny and say, isn't this a smoking cessation program? Yeah, bear with us. You can smoke, but just pay attention as you smoke. And what they were noticing was something remarkable. Here's an example from one of our individuals. She said, smells like stinky cheese and tastes like chemicals. Yuck. So here, we don't have to convince her that smoking is bad. That's why she's there to quit smoking, but she can't stop, right? This is at a more primitive part of her brain. So cognitively, she knows that it's bad, but what happens when we get stressed out? That part of our brain, the prefrontal cortex, that is there for cognitive control goes completely offline. So it's useless. And this is, the deer in headlights phenomenon. We've all been in this situation where somebody says, introduce me to your spouse, and you've only been married 25 years, and suddenly you've forgotten your spouse's name because the president of your company wants to know your spouse's name. So the prefrontal cortex is not as reliable as we'd like it to be. But when you can affect things from the bottom up, from the even deeper, the more evolutionarily conserved part of the brain, which really involves these visceral sensations, suddenly we can start to affect change. Because what this woman was pointing out is that you can't pretend that smoking tastes good. And from there, disenchantment starts to take hold. It's kind of like pulling on Santa Claus's beard. You can't pretend that you saw that this wasn't actually Santa Claus. You can't go back and say, no, Santa Claus is real. That starts to creep in, and the disenchantment starts to take hold. So I won't go through, as Yogi Berra says, you can actually observe a lot just by watching. So I won't go through all the details, but we did a randomized control trial just to see if mindfulness training could help people quit smoking. We'd done work with cocaine dependence and alcohol dependence and found that it was pretty helpful. But we tackled the hardest addiction to quit, smoking. And we found that it was actually twice as good as gold standard behavioral treatment. So this was the American Lung Association's Freedom from Smoking training, very good treatment, only half as good as mindfulness training. And these gains that the folks were seeing with mindfulness training largely were maintained up to 4 months later, which was as far out as we could look. Now, you might be looking, this is a 36% quit rate. This is actually up on the same order of magnitude as some of the best medications out there. So Chantix or varenicline is typically prescribed for 12 weeks or more and gives you at 1 year about a 33% quit rate. So with this training, folks are getting very good quit rates. So when we saw this, we started to ask ourselves, what's actually going on? And we could hypothesize that mindfulness would be working by dissociating the craving and smoking. So you can think of craving as a fire and the cigarettes as fuel for that fire. And each time you smoke a cigarette, you throw a log on the fire. Well, if you stop adding fuel to the fire, eventually the fire doesn't go out on its own like that. It's only gradually as that residual fuel is consumed. So that was a hypothesis that we could test. And I'm not going to, I won't bore you with all the details, but I'm just going to show you a couple of really interesting things. One is very strong correlation. So between craving and smoking. The more people crave, the more they smoked at baseline when they started treatment. But after just 4 weeks of training, that association was completely gone. And when we did all the fancy math behind it, it had nothing to do with craving at baseline, nothing to do with cigarette use, nothing to do with end-of-treatment craving. It had everything to do with the mindfulness training. So when people were mindful, they could actually crave and not smoke. And this was even borne out in the raw data. You can see here at the end of treatment, the craving levels are the same for the people that quit smoking here in red and the people that don't quit smoking here in white. But over time, as people had quit smoking, their cravings eventually die off. Just like we hypothesized, just like that fire when you stop adding fuel to it. So instead of providing avoidance or substitute behaviors, it does seem that mindfulness training is actually coming in here and driving this wedge between craving and smoking, and perhaps even dismantling the core addictive loop, which may be why we see long-term efficacy with it. Okay. So I think we can even add here another way to think of this guy, Sid, as a physician, because he could clearly diagnose what the problem was by looking at these psychological mechanisms and then effect a cure, help people work with craving, ride it out so that they didn't actually smoke. Now, it's interesting. At the Yale campus, they spray painted on the crosswalks "Look up," because the students have suddenly forgotten. These are smart students, have forgotten how to look both ways before crossing the street, because they're so sucked into their phones, right? So we can take. We all know that modern technology is here to stay, and we can look at this technology and say, well, how can we actually use technology for good as compared to things like getting addicted to our phones? So we took this training and we said, well, let's actually develop an app plus an online community where we can actually deliver mindfulness training at people's fingertips. And this is really important because context-dependent memory is actually the critical component of an addiction. You don't learn to smoke in your therapist's office. You learn to smoke on your front porch, outside of work, in your car, or whatever. So if you can actually learn to write out cravings at that point of contact, you might be more likely to be able to distance or dissociate those context-dependent memories from behavior or change that behavior. So we developed this program where we could deliver mindfulness training in bite-sized pieces. We could take that manual and put it into playlists where every day people could go through 3 to 10 minutes of this program. I'll show you an example of an animation that they can use to learn the core concepts, and also use in vivo exercises so they can mindfully smoke. We couldn't do these mindful smoking exercises in our clinic because we were on a smoke-free campus. Here they can do this at the point of contact. And of course, we can build in experience sampling so we can test efficacy and make sure it works. And I'll just give you an example of this. So these in-the-moment exercises, one of the acronyms we use is RAIN. You have to recognize, oh, that's a craving. And you can imagine this for anxiety, for rumination, for a number of other things. Just insert that word here. First, you have to recognize that you're anxious. Otherwise, you're just going to reactively do what you try to do to get rid of that anxiety as fast as you can. The next step is to allow it to be there. We typically think of anxiety and cravings as uncomfortable, so we want them to go away as quickly as possible, or we shove them off into the corner. Paradoxically, we have to invite them in so we can really see what's going on. And as part of that, we can just ask ourselves, get curious, and investigate what's going on in my body right now. And from moment to moment, we can start to notice, oh, this is tightness, this is tension, this is burning, this is clenching in my shoulders, and start to see that anxiety or a craving or whatever is just made up of physical sensations that are coupled with thoughts. They're not as terrible as we thought they were. I had a patient come into my office. He said, I feel like my head's going to explode. And I said, okay, well, when your head explodes, put the pieces back together and give me a call, because we'll document the first case of head exploding from craving, right? Because it really feels like it's going to be terrible, but when we break it down into its component pieces, it's not as bad, and we can actually ride these things out. And we put this front and center in the app. We call it the wantometer. Anytime you want a cigarette, you can click on there, and it can walk you through the RAIN exercise so you can actually learn it. And we can pair this with an online community so that people can get peer support, and I can even moderate the community and answer questions for people all over the world. I'll just give you a brief demo of how all of this actually fits together, because it can be hard to imagine. Oops, let's go back. Try hitting the middle. There we go.
Welcome to Craving to Quit, a 3-week program that will help you quit smoking. This training, delivered live at Yale University, has been shown to be twice as effective as other quit smoking therapies. Now I'll walk you through the basic idea about how habits are formed. First, recognize that the wanting or craving is coming on and relax into it.
And I'll give you an example also of what the animations look like that we can use to deliver these core messages. If you want to hit that play.
Today we're going to explain cravings through the metaphor of a screaming child. I know you've heard and seen a child throwing a tantrum. Perhaps for some of you, it was your own child. This child is screaming because he wants something. And you as the parent want him to stop screaming. All your child wants is a lollipop. So in this metaphor, think of your cravings as the child's tantrum. The lollipop is like the cigarettes. But what should you do? Yell at the child? That might make things worse. Gag the child? That will stop the screaming in the short term, but you know what will happen as soon as you take the gag away. You could just give him a lollipop. Congratulations, you've just taught your child to scream for lollipops. In other words, you just taught him that screaming is a good way to get what he wants. What might you do instead? Here's a novel concept. Just let him scream himself out. What? Have you ever seen a child scream forever? Sometimes they scream so hard and so long that you think their head, or your head, might explode. But it never does. What happens instead? Eventually, the child gets tired and stops.
Okay, great. So we talked a little bit about where stress comes from, how it's perpetuated, and even how some of these psychological mechanisms of it, when we can understand it, mindfulness can actually come in and affect real behavioral change. So I want to shift gears just for the next few minutes now and talk about what's actually going on in the brain. And we can start with the story of Lolo Jones. So some of you might be familiar with her. She's an Olympic hurdler. She was actually favored to win the Olympic gold medal in the 2008 Olympics. And in fact, she was in the finals, in the lead, at the 9th of 10 hurdles. And in a Time magazine interview, she said something like, you know, I was just in an amazing rhythm, and at some point I knew I was winning the race. It wasn't like, oh, I'm about to win the Olympic gold medal. It just seemed like another race. And at a point after that, I noticed that I was telling myself to make sure my legs were snapping out, so I overtried. That's when I hit the hurdle. So the point here is not that she was thinking. She had plenty of thoughts. But the key here is that she tripped herself up by getting caught up in her thinking, right? As she described, she overtried. And so she finished 7th instead of winning the Olympic gold medal. Now, it turns out that we spend a lot of time getting caught up in our thoughts. So there's a study that was done at Harvard that found that about 50% of the time we're actually not paying attention to the present moment. We're either thinking about the past, regretting what we did, worrying about the future, but we're anywhere but here and now. And you can imagine when we get caught up in that type of thinking, this can be stressful. And on the far extreme of that is addiction, when we're so caught up that we're doing all sorts of behaviors despite adverse consequences. And if we're doing this so much, we can actually measure it in the brain. And there was a group at Washington University in St. Louis that serendipitously dubbed what's now called the default mode network. And they had found this because they were using a control task that they would, where they would have people lie on an fMRI scanner, and the instruction was don't do anything in particular. So what do we do when we don't do anything in particular? We'll get to that in a minute. What I want to highlight is the two main hubs of the default mode network, the posterior cingulate cortex and the medial prefrontal cortex. You don't have to remember the details. Just think of these as midline brain structures. One's more in the front, one's more in the back of your brain. And it turns out, this is one of my colleagues at MIT, Sue Whitfield-Gabrielli, did a study. She had people lay in the scanner and not do anything in particular, and then she also had them do an explicit self-referential task. So she showed them words and said, decide if this word describes you or not. And when she looked at both of those tasks and she looked to see what was similar between the two, she found that, lo and behold, these two main hubs of the default mode network get activated regardless of whether you're not doing anything in particular or you're doing something self-referential. Because guess what we do when we don't do anything in particular? We're thinking about something in reference to ourselves. And it also turns out that, especially the posterior cingulate cortex, the back part of these hubs of the brain, gets activated when we're craving. So when we're craving cigarettes, when we're resisting craving, when we're getting caught up in all sorts of things. Now, it's interesting, the same group, Hugh Garavan's group, found that this same brain region gets activated during physiologic thirst. And I say that's interesting because back in the ancient Buddhist psychology, the term for craving is tanha, which literally translated means thirst. Interesting. So we can ask ourselves, well, what about the self is actually processed? What's going on in the posterior cingulate cortex? And the hypothesis is that it might be related to getting caught up in our experience. So experientially getting narrowed in, getting sucked in. And we can all imagine this, like when we're sucked into a craving, it's to the detriment. We're not paying attention to anything else. We're totally sucked in. So what does mindfulness training do? Well, it helps us get out of our own way. Or in other words, it helps us not get caught up in ourselves, not get caught up in our experience. So is this actually true? We could study this. So we took experienced and novice meditators, we had them meditate in our fMRI scanner, and we measured their brain activity. And we looked across the entire brain, and we only found 4 brain regions that were significantly different between the two groups. And 2 of those 4 were the medial prefrontal cortex and the posterior cingulate. And I showed them in blue here because blue means they were less active in experienced meditators compared to novices. So novices were activating their default mode network just like other people were doing, but experienced meditators were actually deactivating it. Those regions were quieter. And it didn't matter what type of meditation it was across all these 3 different types of meditations that we studied. Now, I just want to bring up this idea of compassion for a second, because for any of you that are in the healthcare field, or any of you that have had healthcare providers, which is probably everyone, we talk about empathy, and physicians and healthcare providers are supposed to learn or hopefully have some empathy so that we can put in our patients' shoes. Now, one of the problems here is that our patients often come to us and they're suffering. So if we're constantly putting ourselves in the shoes of someone that's suffering, that can be exhausting. We can get burnt out. The difference between empathy and something like compassion is that compassion is being able to be with suffering in a way that's non-self-referential, right? It's not about us. It's just that when we see suffering, we're naturally moved to act. And so it's often described as the ability to suffer with. Compassion, is suffer with. The root is literally that. But then there's this movement to help. And in mindfulness training, this is often described as loving kindness. So we studied loving kindness, and loving kindness is basically just an intentional well-wishing, where we're genuinely wishing the well for ourselves and others. When we had experienced meditators practice loving kindness in the scanner, we found that these same self-referential brain regions were deactivated when they were practicing this. So this literally was not about themselves as they were practicing loving kindness. So this suggests that compassion and loving kindness are actually different than things like empathy, where we can get burnt out by this, but these seem to be limitless. And it's interesting, the early languaging for loving kindness in some of the other states, they're called the divine abodes, or the immeasurables, because they're limitless. Now, these findings that we had were somewhat different than what had been reported in the literature before, so we looked for a way to actually confirm what we were doing. And I like Richard Feynman's Nobel Prize-winning physicist, and it's absolutely true. If I come in, I like meditation, I think it's a great thing, then I might bias myself. I might put on those types of glasses where I'm going to go looking for results. So we turned to a technique that one of my colleagues at Yale had been developing called real-time neurofeedback, where we can actually give people feedback from specific brain regions in real time. In this case, the posterior cingulate cortex. And we can also do a bunch of control experiments, which I'm not going to show you tonight. And the idea, the task that we gave people was to lie in the scanner with their eyes open and to meditate while this graph was filling in the background, okay? And this graph was measuring their brain activity. Every 2 seconds, it'd scan their entire brain and measure the relative increase, as shown in red, or decrease, as shown in blue, of the posterior cingulate cortex. So we could get an objective measurement of how much it was getting activated and how much it was deactivating. And what we had them do was check in from time to time to see if it actually correlated with their subjective experience. So we can cross this chasm of subjective experience and brain activity. And what people reported was a very strong correlation, so about 8 out of 10, between the graph going up and getting increased self-related activation and the graph going down and that correlating with their experience of actually being on the meditative object. Now, these are novices. You can see a lot of variability here. Here's an experienced meditator. Now, even I can tell the difference. I'm not a statistician, but even I can tell the difference between these two brains. They're very different. So let me show you what this looks like, because we can collect a lot of very interesting information with this new technique. Here's an experienced meditator. He said, at the beginning, I caught myself trying to guess when the words were going to end. That was the active baseline. And when the meditation was going to begin. So I was kind of like, okay, ready, set, go. And then there was an additional word popped up, and I was like, oh, shit. And there's this red spike. And then I immediately settled in, and I was really getting into it. And I thought, oh, my gosh, this is amazing. It's describing exactly what I'm saying. And then you see that red spike. I was like, okay, don't get distracted. And then I got back into it, and it went blue again. I was like, oh, this is unbelievable. It's doing exactly what my mind's doing. So he was laughing at this point. He said that he finds it really funny. That's a perfect map of what my mind was going through. Now, I just want to show you a couple of examples of this that are really striking, because we were starting to see things that we hadn't even hypothesized or anticipated. This person said, I was worried that I wasn't using the graph, so I tried to look at it harder, excuse me, or to pay attention more. Red. Toward the middle, I had some thoughts which I don't see because I just let them flow by. And this one's remarkable. Look at that. He said, I noticed the more I relaxed and stopped trying to do anything, the bluer it went. No, try not. Do or do not. There is no try. Now I get what Yoda was talking about. And it's interesting for those of you that are familiar with Mihai Csikszentmihalyi's concept of flow. So he talks about this state that's effortless, that's timeless, that's selfless. We actually had meditators in the scanner meditating, reporting getting into flow. This person reported there was a sense of flow being with the breath. And she said it flowed deep in the middle, and you can see that correlating with her brain activity getting even quieter. So we might be asking ourselves, okay, these are experienced meditators. Are you kidding? I'd have to start right now and meditate the rest of my life. But this is where we can turn to Vince Lombardi, who is this Green Bay Packers coach. He's actually the person they named the trophy after that they give out at the Super Bowl. He said it's not about practice, it's about perfect practice. Only perfect practice makes perfect. So what's he talking about? So if we ask ourselves, what ingredients do you need to make a good mindfulness soup? Well, of course, we have to pay attention, right? Here's a novice meditator, 3, 6, 9 minutes. You can see a lot of red here. Novice meditator. Suddenly his brain looks completely different. It's not like we gave him a quick brain transplant. He said, oh, well, I felt a lot more relaxed, like it was less of a struggle to prevent my mind from wandering. Well, it's interesting, what this person discovered is described as one of 7 factors of awakening. And it's the 5th factor of awakening. The literal term is passaddhi, which can be translated as tranquility or relaxation. And you can all imagine if you're trying to concentrate on an object or even a book or anything else, it only works until you get tired. But if you just relax and you get interested, suddenly you can concentrate a lot more, and that's what this person found. Here's an experienced meditator who was focusing on that interest, on that curiosity. Look at his brain. Boom, boom, boom. So he was talking about the second factor of awakening, which is about interest. And when we're really interested in something, it's like a good book. You don't have to force yourself to pay attention. When you're interested, suddenly you pay attention. Now imagine applying that interest to the causes of stress and really paying attention. Wow, what's causing my stress? Imagine how much more we can learn about what's actually causing it so that we can let go. Here's another novice. This is my favorite one. He gave us this. You could kind of hear this because we communicate with them through an intercom because they're in the scanner when they're in the control room. And you could hear this little smug voice saying, yeah, I don't think your scanner thing works. Because I was thinking about my breath and it was red. It was kind of like, ee. Very next shrine. Oh, I get it. Focused on the physical sensation instead of thinking in and out, right? So not getting caught up in the thinking, but really focusing on the embodied experience, which we can explain until we're blue in the face, but it's much harder to do. This is something that this guy discovered on his own. So drop the self. Now I'm just going to stop with this great quote by Jack Hubner. He says, the ego is a bottomless pit of suckiness, and so you finally let go of the self that clings to itself. True freedom comes when the ego goes. And then we can come back to our little riddle from Hoika. Comes to Bodhidharma and says, my mind is not at ease, please pacify my mind. Bring me your mind and I will pacify it for you. When I look for my mind, I cannot find it. There, I have pacified it for you. So I'll stop there and just point out that tons of people went into this work, as well as funding from the NIH, as well as generous private donors, which is really helpful because it's really hard to get funding these days. So write your Congress people and tell them not to cut NIH funding. And the other thing I'll mention is the Center for Mindfulness just launched a free online community. So if you're interested in learning more about mindfulness or connecting with others, you can go, you can join, you don't even have to join, and you can look. There are lots of video resources, there are book recommendations that you can connect with other folks. So I will stop there and would be happy to take any questions. Thank you very much.